Hi guys, some of you were asking to get a bit more information about what web standards is all about, okay, which is this section B here. So as it says in the guide here, it says you need to outline what web standards are, who sets them, and for what purpose. Um, Give reasons for the development of the standards and the consequences of ignoring them. Okay, so um, there were a couple of links I put in here which might be something, well, should be something that you have a look at. I have had a bit of feedback that it's a little bit difficult to understand some of it. So I've put this other link in here, okay, and it's a link to this particular website here, okay, from a guy called, what's his name? Robert Nyman is his name. So this gives a bit more of a simple introduction to what web standards are about. So let's just go through a few key things that he mentions here. Okay, so he makes the point that web standards aren't really standards as such. Standards is something that everybody basically has to follow. Okay, and he makes the point that web standards are actually recommendations. So what recommendations? What is this about? So basically a web standard or a recommendation is a set of guidelines that most of web developers agree on. So what does that mean? Okay, so here are the key web standards that web developers, basically I just think every web developer these days would agree on these standards here. Okay, so what is he saying here? So it consists of, it says web standards are used in reference to developing HTML or XHTML, basically your website structure. Okay, and it consists then of these basically three different standards. That we have valid HTML code, that is semantically correct code, and we'll go through what semantically means again in a minute, although that was done last year, and the separation of content, the HTML from presentation, which is CSS, and interaction. So it's a separation of those three things. Okay, so what does it mean by valid HTML? Okay, is okay, as he says here, basically what validating your code means is that the code you have in your web page should be according to the definitions given by the doc type that you've chosen for your document. So for example, if we're using HTML5, then that code that you've written should be written in accordance with that HTML5 definition. Okay, just trying to see if there's any other key points here. It says by having valid code, you don't have to rely on different web browsers varying error handling mechanisms, but instead it's meant to be rendered the same by all web browsers. Okay, it says by validating your code, you are very well likely to find errors and attend to a number of layout problems you never thought would be related to the actual HTML. Okay, so one web standard is to have valid HTML code. Okay, and there is some further links here that you could read about that and some tools here. Okay, semantically correct code is the second web standard. Okay, is the idea here is that each element in a web page should have an element that matches its meaning and conveys its value and purpose. Okay, so the basic explanation of this is to use proper elements depending on the context. Okay, so it gives an example here. We're just using these basic divs with classes attached to it. Okay, in comparison to that, where we use proper things like H1 tags, paragraph tags, unordered lists. And then with HTML5, you've got things like header and footer tags, you've got article tags, you've got section tags, and all of those, if used in the right context, are better at conveying its purpose in the website. So a footer, basically, even the name of that conveys its purpose. So semantically correct code is using those correct tags and things like that in the right place. And what you usually need to do is to find examples of that from the different websites. Not too many, just some examples. And the third web standard is the separation of content. That's the HTML from presentation and interaction. Okay, and he says there are a number of different reasons why it's important that that is done, and he gives 4 key ones here. Performance, better performance. So external files, CSS and JSON, will be cached in the end user's web browser after the first load. As a result, it dramatically decreases load times and improves the experience, therefore. Overview, you know where to look for and place code, each layer for its own purpose. What does it mean by that? Well, you can look for structural things in the HTML, you can look for presentation things in the CSS, and you can look for interaction things in the JavaScript. So it's easier to find things rather than having all of this mixed together in one massive file. Okay, what's the next thing he mentions here? Reusability. Okay, so you could easily reuse JavaScript from one website to another, or you could use CSS from one website to another, or you could have a very similar structure but different CSS to have a different look to that structure. So each of these things can be reused on different websites, so it's making that a lot easier to do. And last of all, maintenance. You have all the code in one central location, applying all the presentation and interaction codes to all the web pages within a website. So that's not a great explanation, really, I don't think. The ease of maintenance is that really it comes back to knowing where to find things and being able to easily make changes, say on your CSS, that then would affect all your pages if it's something that's linked to all your pages. Okay, so it's a lot easier to find things and therefore make changes if these things are separated out. Now there are some other reasons that for the separation of content, presentation, interaction, and they're mentioned on this other web page here, the W3C page. It says why separate. So they look at efficiency of code, ease of maintenance, accessibility, device compatibility. It makes search engines, it makes it easier for those to find information about your pages, and yeah, as it says here, it's just good practice as well. So that's a very quick overview of what web standards are about. And just going back to one note here, that should help you say what web standards are. Now, who sets them? Who sets those recommendations? So if we go back to here, you'll see that at the top here, he mentions that there are some different standardizing organization, such as ISO, this ECMA, and the main one is W3C. Okay, so that should help with that. And the purpose, so we've outlined already some of the purposes for the web standards. Okay, the reasons for the development of the standards and the consequences of ignoring them. Well, just to take that a little bit back to front, the consequences of ignoring them are that you will have You won't have good performing websites. They will be harder to maintain. You won't be able to reuse code easily. Okay, and going back to this web page here, the code won't be very efficient. Websites won't be as accessible. So make sure you read the explanation here about that. Web pages might not be compatible with different devices. Makes it harder for search engines to find information, and it is bad practice. Alright, so there's some of the reasons or consequences of not going with web standards. And the reasons for the development, well, the main reasons for the development of web standards were a little bit historical background here. First, web pages were written with, if I just try and get an example here. Okay, this is an example of a standard web page today. But if you looked at ones for, say, 15 years ago, or even maybe even 10 years ago, you wouldn't just find the HTML here. You'd find all the CSS and styling information bundled in here, together with maybe JavaScript tossed in here as well. And it was a real spaghetti code. It was very difficult to understand and follow. So the reasons for separating out the three things, the structure, the CSS, and the JavaScript, was to make that process of trying to develop pages more easily and make them easier to follow, more easily maintained, and reuse parts of the code was some of the driving forces for using, or the development even, of CSS. Okay, so yeah, that hopefully gives you a bit more of an overview as to why web standards were developed. On the other reason too, this is an important one, is that you had different browser companies like Microsoft, even though they obviously produce a lot more than just browsers, and there were companies like Netscape, who I suppose their software sort of developed later into Firefox. But you had different companies basically setting their own rules, and so web developers had to actually write sometimes different code to run on different browsers. Okay, and so you had a web page or a website where you couldn't just write one lot of HTML. You had to actually write different versions for different browsers, because every company had their own standards as to how web pages should look and how they should take the code and show them on the screen. So that was another key reason why eventually they decided, well, that's not a great idea. We need to have some standards that all developers of browsers need to adhere to. So web developers can write one set of code, one set of HTML, one set of CSS and JavaScript that's going to work the same on all browsers. Okay, so yeah, let me know if there's still parts of that you're not too clear about, and I'll try and clarify them for you further. Okay, catch you in class.